How America Got an Empire. In 1898, Cuba was fighting for independence from Spain. American newspapers ran stories about Spanish soldiers starving Cuban civilians in camps, and public pressure to step in kept building. Then, in February, the American battleship USS Maine blew up in Havana Harbor and killed 266 sailors. No one knew what caused it, but newspapers blamed Spain and the country went to war. While the war was starting, American officials found Filipino leader Emilio Aguinaldo in Hong Kong and made him a deal. If he helped the U.S. beat Spain, they would back Philippine independence. So Aguinaldo came back on a U.S. Navy ship, helped take Manila, and his people wrote a constitution and set up their own government, the first one like it in Asia. The war lasted about 4 months, and Spain lost almost everywhere it fought. At Manila Bay, an American fleet destroyed every Spanish ship without losing a single one of its own, and in Cuba, the fighting was over in days. Spain signed the Treaty of Paris and handed the United States Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines for $20 million. Cuba became independent, but the deal let America send troops back in whenever it wanted and gave it a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. The Philippines did not get independence at all. It went to America. On February 4, 1899, an American soldier shot a Filipino on a bridge in Manila, and within hours, U.S. forces opened fire across the city. Many of the soldiers sent over had just finished the Indian Wars and brought the same tactics. They forced whole villages into camps and burned crops and homes to the ground. They tortured prisoners with something called the water cure, forcing water down a person's throat until they talked or passed out. On the island of Samar, after Filipino fighters killed 48 Americans in a surprise attack, a general ordered his men to kill every male over the age of 10. Over 4,200 Americans and 20,000 Filipino soldiers died. The camps, the burning, and the destroyed food supply killed as many as 1 million Filipino civilians. The war was declared over in 1902, but the fighting went on until 1913. The Philippines stayed under American control for 44 years until independence came in 1946. Puerto Rico and Guam are still American territories today. The Invasion of Europe. By June 1944, America had been fighting in World War II for 2.5 years, but most of Europe was still under Nazi control. The Soviets had been fighting Germany from the east and losing millions, so they kept pushing the Americans and British to invade from the west and force Germany to fight on two sides. The Allies spent months building a fake army in England out of blow-up tanks, wooden planes, and fake radio signals to make the Germans think the landing would happen at a completely different beach. It worked so well that even after the real invasion started, the Germans kept an entire army waiting in the wrong place for 7 weeks. On June 6, 1944, over 5,000 ships and 11,000 planes carried 160,000 troops across the English Channel to Normandy. Before dawn, thousands of paratroopers had already jumped behind German lines to cut off roads and bridges so backup could not reach the coast. The plan was to bomb German defenses before the soldiers reached shore, but at Omaha Beach, the bombs missed. The guns were still firing when the first boats landed, and the men stepping off walked straight into machine gun fire. About 4,400 soldiers died before the first day was over. After the beaches, soldiers spent 2 months fighting through thick farmland where every field had to be taken one at a time. It cost 125,000 Americans killed or wounded just to push out of Normandy. They fought across France toward Germany, but in December, Germany launched a surprise attack through a frozen forest. The Battle of the Bulge killed or wounded 90,000 Americans in 6 weeks, but it used up everything Germany had left. By May 1945, the war was over. Over 180,000 Americans died. France lost over 500,000 people, cities were bombed flat, and millions had nothing left. After the First World War, the winners made Germany pay for everything. 20 years later, there was a second one. So after this one, America spent $13 billion rebuilding the countries it destroyed, including Germany. It created NATO, helped build the United Nations, and set up the trade and banking systems that most of the Western world still runs on today. Instead of going home like it did last time, America stayed. 80 years later, there are still American troops stationed across Europe. The occupation of Japan. By the summer of 1945, it had been nearly 4 years since Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and pulled America into the war. American forces had spent most of that time fighting across the Pacific, taking islands one at a time. The Japanese military fought almost to the last man on every one of them. At Iwo Jima, nearly all 21,000 Japanese soldiers were killed. At Okinawa, the fighting killed 12,500 Americans, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers, and as many as 150,000 civilians. Japanese pilots flew their planes straight into American ships, sinking 29 of them. Before the island fighting was over, American bombers had already been burning Japanese cities to the ground. On a single night in March 1945, a bombing raid on Tokyo killed around 100,000 people and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. Over the next few months, bombers hit 64 more cities. The military believed that landing troops on Japan itself could cost over 1 million lives on both sides, so the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Hiroshima killed around 140,000 people by the end of the year. Nagasaki killed around 80,000. 6 days after Nagasaki, Japan gave up. On September 2, 1945, American troops landed in Japan, and General Douglas MacArthur took over the country. Over the next 7 years, his staff wrote a brand new constitution, gave women the right to vote, broke up the biggest companies, took land from wealthy families and gave it to farmers, and put the emperor under the control of an elected government. They also wrote in a rule called Article 9 that said Japan could never have a military or go to war again. With no military to pay for and American money helping rebuild, Japan's economy grew faster than almost any country in history. In less than 30 years, it went from rubble to the second biggest economy in the world. Over 400,000 Americans died in World War II, and more than 2.5 million Japanese. The country America burned to the ground became one of its closest allies. The Constitution MacArthur's staff wrote in 1947 has not changed since, and there are still over 50,000 American troops in Japan today. How America got the West. In 1845, the United States added Texas as a state. Mexico had never accepted that Texas was independent and warned that adding it would mean war. President James Polk wanted to expand the country all the way to the Pacific, and there was a stretch of land between Texas and Mexico that both countries claimed, so he sent American troops right into it and waited. In April 1846, Mexican soldiers attacked an American patrol there, and Polk told Congress that Mexico had shed American blood on American soil. Congress declared war. A young congressman named Abraham Lincoln challenged Polk to prove the attack had actually happened on American soil, but Congress had already voted. The Mexican military outnumbered the Americans in almost every major battle, but kept losing. At Buena Vista, 4,600 Americans beat a Mexican force of 15,000. General Winfield Scott landed 10,000 troops at Veracruz, then marched inland and fought his way through town after town until he took Mexico City in September 1847. Around 13,000 Americans died, most of them from disease, and somewhere between 25,000 and 40,000 Mexicans were killed. By February 1848, with American troops still in its capital, Mexico signed a peace deal. Mexico gave up over half its territory, more than 500,000 square miles, for $15 million. The land America took became California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, most of Arizona and Colorado, and parts of several other states. Around 100,000 Mexicans were already living there, and the deal said they could stay and become American citizens, but many lost their property anyway. At the time, the number of states that allowed slavery and states that banned it was almost even, so every new state created from the land could tip the balance one way or the other. Congress could not agree on which way the new territories would go. Within a few years, people in Kansas were killing each other over it. The officers who served together in Mexico, men like Ulysses Grant and Robert E. Lee, ended up on opposite sides of a civil war 13 years later. That war killed over 600,000 Americans. The Invasion of Korea. After World War II, Korea had been split in half. The Soviet Union controlled the North, and the United States controlled the South. On June 25, 1950, around 75,000 North Korean soldiers crossed the border and invaded the South. Washington saw a communist takeover happening right next to Japan, so it sent troops under the United Nations flag to stop them. American and South Korean forces were driven down to a small area around the port of Busan at the southern tip of Korea. Then, General Douglas MacArthur landed 80,000 troops at Incheon, 150 miles behind the North Korean front lines, and cut off their entire army. Within weeks, the North Koreans were in full retreat, and UN forces moved all the way up to the Chinese border. China had warned them not to come that close to its border, but UN forces kept pushing north. In November 1950, around 300,000 Chinese soldiers came across and hit them from every direction. At the Chosin Reservoir, 20,000 American troops were surrounded by 120,000 Chinese in temperatures that dropped to 35 below zero. They fought their way out over 2 weeks, losing over 1,000 killed and thousands more wounded and frostbitten. The Chinese sent UN forces back into the South. Truman fired MacArthur for publicly pushing to bomb China, and the fighting went on for 2 more years before both sides signed a ceasefire on July 27, 1953. Around 36,500 Americans died, and over 100,000 were wounded. On the other side, 200,000 Chinese soldiers were killed, and between 2 and 3 million Korean civilians died. After 3 years of fighting, the border between North and South Korea was almost exactly where it had been before the war started. South Korea went from one of the poorest countries on Earth to the world's 13th largest economy. There are still around 28,000 American troops stationed along that border. No peace treaty has ever been signed. The invasion of Iraq. After the September 11th attacks, the Bush administration said Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and ties to al-Qaeda. In February 2003, Colin Powell went before the United Nations with satellite photos and intelligence reports to convince them to support an invasion. UN weapons inspectors were already in Iraq and said they were not finding anything, but the United States went in anyway. 6 weeks later, around 150,000 American and British troops crossed into Iraq. Baghdad fell in 3 weeks. Saddam's government collapsed, and on May 1st, President Bush stood on an aircraft carrier in front of a banner that read, "Mission accomplished." No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. The man in charge of the American occupation, Paul Bremer, shut down the entire Iraqi military and banned anyone from Saddam's political party from holding a government job. Around 400,000 trained soldiers were sent home with no pay, no jobs, and their weapons. Most of the people who knew how to run the country were gone overnight. Within months, former soldiers and fighters from across the region were attacking American troops and each other. Iraq had two main religious groups, Sunni and Shia, and the violence between them turned into a civil war, with car bombings, executions, and whole neighborhoods emptied out. The United States sent 30,000 more troops in 2007, and the violence dropped. American forces left Iraq in 2011. Iran backed the Shia-led government that took over, and that government pushed Sunnis out of power. Many of the former military officers who had been sent home in 2003 became leaders of a group that called itself the Islamic State. In 2014, ISIS took Mosul, a city of nearly 2 million people, with around 1,500 fighters. The Iraqi army, trained and equipped by the United States at a cost of $25 billion, fell apart. Around 4,600 Americans died, and over 32,000 were wounded. Somewhere between 150,000 and 600,000 Iraqis were killed. The United States spent over $2 trillion on the war. Iraq has not been stable since. The invasion of Vietnam. After France lost control of Vietnam in 1954, the country was split in half. The Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, wanted to bring the country back together under one government. The United States backed the government in the South and started sending military advisors in the late 1950s. In August 1964, an American destroyer was patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin when North Vietnamese torpedo boats came after it. They fought, and 2 days later the ship reported another attack. Congress voted to give the president the power to use military force without officially declaring war. Years later, government documents showed that attack never happened. By 1968, over 500,000 American troops were in Vietnam. The military said the war was almost won. Then in January, North Vietnamese soldiers and communist fighters in the South launched attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. Americans at home watched their own embassy in Saigon get attacked on live television. Within weeks, Johnson announced he would not run for re-election. Nixon promised to end the war and started pulling troops out while increasing the bombing. The United States began secretly bombing Cambodia to destroy North Vietnamese supply routes. The last American forces left in 1973 after a peace deal was signed in Paris. 2 years later, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, and the South fell. The bombing had wrecked Cambodia, and a group called the Khmer Rouge took power that same year. They killed between 1.5 and 2 million of their own people in 4 years. Congress took back the war power it had given the president after the Gulf of Tonkin and passed the War Powers Act, which said the president could no longer send troops into combat for more than 60 days without its approval. No president since has agreed that the law is binding. Around 58,000 Americans died and over 300,000 were wounded. Somewhere between 2 and 3 million Vietnamese were killed on both sides. The United States dropped more bombs on Vietnam than it dropped in all of World War II. It was the first war America ever lost. The Invasion of Afghanistan. On September 11, 2001, 19 hijackers flew planes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and killed nearly 3,000 people. Al-Qaeda, the group behind it, was based in Afghanistan and run by Osama bin Laden. The Taliban government refused to hand him over, so the United States invaded in October 2001. American special forces and CIA teams, linked up with Afghan fighters who had been battling the Taliban for years. Together, they took down the Taliban in about 2 months. Bin Laden escaped into the mountains of Tora Bora near the Pakistani border. The United States asked local fighters to block his escape routes instead of sending in American troops. He crossed into Pakistan and disappeared for nearly 10 years. In 2003, the Bush administration invaded Iraq and pulled resources out of Afghanistan. The Taliban came back together in the mountains and across the border in Pakistan. By 2009, Obama sent 30,000 more troops, bringing the total to around 100,000. The military pushed the Taliban back, but every time they left an area, the Taliban moved right back in. In 2011, American special forces found and killed bin Laden in a house in Pakistan, less than a mile from Pakistan's military academy. Obama pulled most American troops out by 2014 and left the Afghan army in charge of the fighting. Each year after that, the Taliban took more territory. In February 2020, the Trump administration signed a deal directly with the Taliban that set a deadline for all American troops to leave. The Afghan government was not part of the deal. When the last American forces left in August 2021, the Taliban took over the entire country in 11 days. The Afghan army did not fight back. Around 2,400 Americans were killed and over 20,000 were wounded. More than 170,000 Afghans died, including over 47,000 civilians. The war cost the United States more than $2 trillion over 20 years. The Taliban are back in power with billions of dollars worth of American weapons and equipment that were left behind. The Invasion of Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the American-backed government in Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. He took over American-owned businesses, shut down casinos, and started building ties with the Soviet Union. The CIA came up with a plan to train Cubans who had left the country, land them on the island, and start an uprising that would bring Castro down. The plan was put together under Eisenhower, and when Kennedy took office in January 1961, he was told it was ready to go. The CIA said the Cuban people would rise up once the invasion started. Kennedy approved it, but pulled back air support at the last minute because he did not want the United States to look like it was behind the attack. On April 17, 1961, around 1,400 of them landed at the Bay of Pigs. The plan had leaked before the landing, and Castro knew they were coming. His Air Force sank 2 of their supply ships, and 20,000 Cuban soldiers moved in. The uprising the CIA promised never happened. Without air cover or supplies, the invasion fell apart in 3 days. The failed invasion convinced Castro that the United States would try again, so he asked the Soviet Union for protection. In the summer of 1962, the Soviets secretly began shipping nuclear missiles to Cuba. American spy planes spotted the missile sites on October 14, 1962. Kennedy surrounded Cuba with warships and demanded the Soviets remove the missiles. For 13 days, American and Soviet forces were on full alert. Soviet submarines carrying nuclear torpedoes were stopped by American warships. One submarine commander had to be talked out of firing by his fellow officers. The Soviets agreed to pull the missiles out in exchange for the United States promising not to invade Cuba again and secretly removing its own missiles from Turkey. Cuba has been under communist rule ever since. The American ban on trade that started in 1962 is still in place. The invasion of Kuwait. Iraq had just come out of an 8-year war with Iran and owed tens of billions of dollars, most of it to Kuwait. Saddam Hussein accused Kuwait of pumping too much oil and driving prices down. On August 2, 1990, he sent 100,000 troops into Kuwait and took the entire country in 2 days. The United States had been buying oil from the Gulf for decades, and Saudi Arabia, right next door, asked for American protection. Within months, the United States put together a coalition of 35 countries and moved nearly 700,000 troops to the region. On January 17, 1991, the coalition started bombing Iraq. For 39 days, they hit military targets, power plants, and bridges across the country. When the ground war started on February 24th, the Iraqi military was the 4th largest in the world. It fell apart in 100 hours. Tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers tried to retreat north on the highway out of Kuwait City, and American aircraft hit the convoy for miles. Commanders stopped the ground war on February 28th. Around 300 Americans were killed. Somewhere between 20,000 and 100,000 Iraqis died, including soldiers and civilians. Kuwait was free, but Saddam was still running Iraq. After the war, Saddam crushed uprisings by 2 groups inside Iraq, the Shia in the south and the Kurds in the north. The United States had encouraged both groups to rise up, but did not help them when Saddam's military moved in. Thousands were killed. American troops stayed in Saudi Arabia after the war to keep Saddam contained. Saudi Arabia is home to Mecca and Medina, the two holiest sites in Islam. Osama bin Laden said having American soldiers near those sites was an occupation of Holy Land and used it to recruit fighters against the United States. Saddam Hussein stayed in power for 12 more years until the United States invaded Iraq again and removed him. If you'd like to see more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.